What if the Apollo 13 mission was never meant to succeed? Because it was never meant to land. We've all heard the story. The heroic failure, the malfunction in space, the crew that narrowly escaped death. Apollo 13 is known as one of NASA's most dramatic missions, but also one of its most unfinished. A mission that was planned, prepared, and launched, only to suddenly be cut short in a way that still raises eyebrows today. But what if that story, the one they told us, is only half the truth? In the world of space mysteries, few events are as emotionally charged and suspiciously clean as Apollo 13. Think about it. A spacecraft flying hundreds of thousands of kilometers from Earth suddenly suffers a catastrophic failure. Yet the crew survives barely, with every system just functional enough to get them back home. It's almost too perfect. The failure, the survival, the drama. It plays out like a script. But here's the part no one talks about. Long before the oxygen tank exploded, Apollo 13 was already showing signs that something was off. This wasn't just a space malfunction. In fact, experts within NASA, engineers, telemetry analysts, mission controllers, have spoken in hushed tones for years about anomalies that preceded the disaster. Electrical surges that didn't make sense. Communication blackouts that weren't reported to the public. Instruments that went haywire days before the official failure. And then, of course, the missing hours of audio. Yes, audio that simply vanished from the official record. 6 hours of communication that were never released, never explained, and never recovered. It's not just conspiracy theorists raising questions. Former aerospace workers have hinted, carefully, that Apollo 13 may have been more than just a mission to the moon, that it carried equipment not listed in public manifests, that it was being tracked by objects that didn't appear on NASA's radar reports, and that the decision to abort may not have been made by the astronauts at all. What if something was waiting out there? Something that forced them to turn back? Something not of this Earth? This isn't just another what-if scenario. This is about patterns, about inconsistencies in the narrative, about how every time we get close to a deeper truth, the data vanishes, or the story gets rewritten. And if Apollo 13 did encounter something unexpected in space, or worse, if it was part of a mission that was never meant to succeed, then that means we've been living under a version of history that was carefully designed to protect us from something much bigger, something still out there, something powerful enough to force a retreat out. So as we unravel this story together, I want you to stay open, not just to the facts, but to the feelings, the unease, the sense that there's more to this than just broken equipment. Because the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. Apollo 13 might have been the mission that told us the most about what we're not allowed to know. And if you've ever felt like something didn't add up in the story of humanity's journey to the stars, you're not alone. What really forced Apollo 13 to come home? We're just getting started. And listen, if you've made it this far, it probably means you feel it too. That quiet pull in your chest, like a truth you've almost remembered. Like something buried under the surface of the official story is finally rising up to be seen. That's not an accident. That's intuition. That's why you're here. If this story already has you questioning what really happened up there, if you've ever looked at the stars and felt like we're not alone, or that we're not being told everything, then I want to ask you to do 3 small things that make a big difference. First, tap that like button, not just for the algorithm, but to show you're one of us, someone who's willing to question, to feel, to go deeper. It lets me know you're here for more than just surface-level stories. Second, leave a comment below and tell me honestly, do you believe the Apollo 13 story as it was told? Or do you feel there's more beneath the surface? You can just write, "I feel it," if this is all hitting somewhere deep inside you. That phrase helps us find each other in the noise. And finally, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. This channel is a safe place for minds that don't settle, for hearts that sense there's more. More mystery, more truth, more awe. If you're still here, you're exactly the kind of person this space was made for, because what we're about to uncover might change the way you see not just space exploration, but Earth itself. Houston, we've had a problem. It's one of the most iconic phrases in the history of space exploration, a sentence that has echoed across generations, taught in schools, featured in movies, and replayed in documentaries. But what if I told you that this phrase is only the surface of a much deeper mystery? What if the Apollo 13 mission wasn't just a failed moon landing, but a carefully orchestrated maneuver hiding something no one was ready to face? From the moment the words were spoken, the world froze. 3 astronauts drifting 200,000 miles from Earth, suddenly thrown into a survival scenario that even NASA hadn't fully prepared for. The oxygen tank had exploded, power was failing, and the dream of landing on the moon had just shattered. Or so we were told. We've all heard the story. A tragic accident, a technical malfunction, a heroic return. But if you really stop and examine the layers beneath that narrative, things start to feel off. Why did a routine stir in the oxygen tanks lead to such catastrophic failure? Why, out of all the missions, did this one, with its heavily altered flight plan, experience one of the most cinematic disasters in space history? To understand what may have really happened aboard Apollo 13, we have to look at the mission, not through the lens of heroism, but through the silence, the gaps, the details that were glossed over in official statements, and the things that were never said at all. In the original flight plan, Apollo 13 wasn't even supposed to land in a particularly groundbreaking location on the moon. There were no new objectives, no urgent need to go. And yet, the mission was pushed forward. Why? Especially when internal reports from NASA, which were only recently declassified, suggested mounting concerns about the spacecraft's condition before launch. If you dig deep enough, you'll find technician logs that mention anomalies, readings in the command module's oxygen tanks days before liftoff. One even called for a system retest, which never happened. What's more disturbing is what happened right after the explosion. Yes, the oxygen tank blew, but many experts have noted that the timeline of damage reported by the crew doesn't fully align with what ground control logged. It's subtle, but it matters. What if the crew wasn't just reacting to an accident, but to something they saw, something they couldn't explain? And here's where the rabbit hole truly begins. Because there are whispers, documented in early NASA forums, and carried through conspiratorial archives, that the crew noticed something unusual even before the blast. A strange shimmer on their monitors, an object not part of the known satellite belt, a signal that appeared briefly on the radar just moments before the explosion disabled most of their telemetry. The public was shown edited footage, carefully crafted press conferences, and a triumphant narrative of problem-solving and human resilience. And yes, much of that was real, but perhaps it was also curated, framed, a distraction. Ask yourself this: why was so much emphasis placed on the danger and so little on the context of what came before it? Why did NASA representatives avoid deeper questions about the source of the tank failure? Why was the final damage report on the spacecraft classified for over 2 decades? As we peel back the layers of Apollo 13's disaster, we're not just uncovering a mechanical failure, we're opening the door to a possibility that has haunted space programs ever since. That maybe, just maybe, we're not being told everything. And if that's true, then the explosion wasn't the scariest thing that happened on that mission. It was just the beginning. The story of Apollo 13's malfunction has always been told with a sense of inevitability, as if the universe simply dealt a bad hand. But when you zoom in on the sequence of events, the so-called failure becomes harder and harder to accept as coincidence. And for some, it doesn't feel like a failure at all, but a warning. Or worse, a cover, the explosion that ripped through. The service module wasn't just dramatic, it was unprecedented. A cryogenic oxygen tank, supposedly designed to withstand extreme conditions, suddenly tore apart after a routine stir. That procedure had been executed on previous missions without incident. So why did it suddenly become catastrophic on Apollo 13? According to NASA's official timeline, the failure happened 55 hours into the mission. But here's the twist. That same oxygen tank had already been flagged months earlier. During a ground test at Kennedy Space Center, technicians noticed it wasn't emptying properly. A simple fix, right? But instead of replacing the tank, standard protocol engineers decided to make it work by using alternative heating methods that pushed it past design limits. The pressure sensors inside were damaged in the process, and no one knew. Or at least, that's the version we've been told. What if someone did know? Some believe the decision to keep that tank, a ticking time bomb, wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate. And when you combine that with the last-minute changes to Apollo 13's landing site and scientific goals, things begin to feel less random and more controlled. Originally, Apollo 13 was supposed to land in the Fra Mauro region of the Moon, an area not known for significant scientific yield. But in the weeks before launch, the mission objectives were quietly reworded. Documents released years later under FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. Requests show that a classified cargo module was attached to the spacecraft, with no explanation. When asked, NASA officials simply said it was routine instrumentation. But astronauts in the program knew better. Routine wasn't the word they used. Now think about this. Apollo 11 had already made history. Apollo 12 proved it wasn't a fluke. Why risk another mission so soon in an area with minimal importance, using damaged equipment? It doesn't add up. Unless, of course, the goal wasn't the moon at all. Or at least, not the one we were shown. Multiple engineers, including some who left NASA quietly in the 70s, claimed that data from Apollo 13's launch telemetry showed anomalies, changes in acceleration patterns, unlogged radio frequencies, and even missing segments of voice communication between the crew and Houston before the explosion. These aren't wild conspiracies from internet forums. These are claims found in archived internal memos, buried under decades of bureaucracy. There's also the chilling fact that backup systems designed to stabilize the spacecraft after a fault, the reaction control system, and the backup guidance computer, both failed in tandem within seconds of the explosion. Redundant systems failing together is not standard. That's systemic compromise. Or interference. What are the odds? The telemetry stream itself had unexplained dead zones, times where the spacecraft's exact orientation couldn't be verified. NASA attributed this to data loss from deep space relay fade, but others, particularly radio signal analysts in Australia, reported that for over 3 minutes, Apollo 13 seemed to blink off the radar, not fade, disappear, like something blocked it or took control of the feed. So we're left with this: a tank that wasn't supposed to explode, explodes, backup systems that never fail, signals that should be clear, vanish, and a mission that should have landed is forced to turn back under a cloud of half-answers and nervous smiles at press conferences. And perhaps the most haunting detail of all, just before the tank burst, one of the astronauts, it's still unclear whether it was Lovell or Swigert, was overheard saying something unusual on an open line. The recording, filtered out in the public versions, contains a brief, distorted moment where the voice says, "It's moving again," above the capsule. That phrase was transcribed by an independent ham radio operator in Spain who intercepted their raw feed before NASA cut the frequency. The official transcripts don't include it. NASA never commented on it, but those 5 words have been dissected for decades. What was it, and why again? These aren't the kinds of questions you ask when you're just dealing with faulty wires and damaged tanks. These are the questions that start to change the way we look at space history and the motivations behind missions that millions trusted without question. And maybe that's exactly the point. If this malfunction was so improbable, maybe it wasn't a malfunction at all. Maybe it was something or someone making sure Apollo 13 didn't get to where it was headed. Before Apollo 13 ever left the ground, something already felt off. Not just technically, but energetically, like a low hum of unease vibrating beneath the surface. In the halls of NASA, they called it pre-launch jitters. But for those closest to the mission, it felt different. It felt wrong. Engineers reported strange malfunctions in the days leading up to liftoff, and not just on the spacecraft. Environmental sensors in the vehicle assembly building began returning corrupted data. Humidity levels dropping to impossible lows, radiation spikes appearing for just seconds and then vanishing again. Electrical systems in the launch tower flickered without explanation. One technician described it as the entire complex holding its breath. And then there was the dream. It sounds strange to bring it up in a technical conversation, but several crew members and at least 2 mission support staff later admitted, off record, to experiencing a nearly identical dream the night before launch. Floating in complete darkness, surrounded by mechanical breathing and the sound of something massive shifting overhead. When they woke up, they assumed it was just nerves. But what are the odds they all dreamed the same thing? On April 9th, during a final full systems test, the spacecraft's guidance system momentarily locked onto the wrong coordinates. Instead of orienting toward the lunar insertion point, it pointed several degrees off, toward an empty patch of deep space. The engineers chalked it up to a software hiccup, but one of the backup flight controllers, who later retired quietly, wrote in his personal log, "It's like the machine was being pulled by something we can't see." That line wouldn't resurface publicly until decades later, but the feeling it described was echoed by others. Mission Commander Jim Lovell himself admitted, years after the fact, that something about Apollo 13 felt more fragile than the others, as if they were being watched or guided, but not by human hands. In the last 48 hours before launch, 3 key technicians working the command module's internal systems were suddenly replaced. No public explanation was given. Internally, the reason was listed as last-minute illness. But years later, one of those men, identified only as DP, in a leaked interview transcript, said he was removed from duty after expressing concerns about anomalous readings in the navigation telemetry that kept resetting themselves and then deleting from the logs. He said he was told, word for word, let it go. It's been approved at the top. Now, let's pause for a second. This is NASA, the most procedure-obsessed agency on Earth. Nothing gets approved without documentation, checklists, review boards. So who exactly is the top when things bypass all of that? Even more unsettling were the birds. On the morning of April 11th, just hours before launch, thousands of seabirds began circling Launch Complex 39A. This was so unusual that several reporters on site mentioned it in their pre-launch coverage. But the footage was quietly edited out of national broadcasts. Eyewitnesses said the birds weren't just flying, they were agitated. Some even crashed into structures, falling dead onto the pad. One journalist, who had covered every launch since Mercury, said, "It was like they were warning us, or trying to stop something." By now, most people would brush all of this off. Faulty sensors, bad dreams, strange weather, animal behavior. It's easy to ignore when you're focused on engineering specs and countdown clocks. But for a mission that nearly ended in tragedy, all these signs feel eerily intentional. Like breadcrumbs leading to something no one was ready to face. Just minutes before ignition, during final systems checks, a comms engineer monitoring internal loop data noticed a spike in interference. The spike wasn't from external radio chatter. It was from inside the spacecraft. Something somewhere inside Apollo 13 had begun emitting a pulsed frequency that didn't match any registered equipment. When he raised the issue, he was told to switch channels. The anomaly was never mentioned again, and there's still the unmarked crate. One photo, leaked from a technician's private collection, shows a crate being loaded into the service module days before launch. It bears no NASA or government insignia, only a handwritten label. Eyes only OOX. No manifest lists it. No documentation confirms it. And yet it's there, visible for a split second in footage that was later trimmed from the official archive. Some speculate it was scientific gear. Others believe it was surveillance equipment meant to monitor lunar anomalies. But a growing theory suggests it was something far more unsettling, something meant to attract attention in deep space. If that's true, what were they trying to summon? By the time Apollo 13's engines fired and the rocket tore into the sky, all these signs, the dreams, the interference, the shadows in the data, had been buried under mission protocol and polished press statements. But for those who paid attention, for those who felt the silence behind the science, the message was already clear. This wasn't just a lunar mission dot. It was the start of something else entirely. If Apollo 13 wasn't just a lunar mission, what was it? On the surface, everything looked normal. 3 astronauts, standard equipment, a public goal: orbit the moon, perform a few experiments, come home. But behind that official narrative, there are cracks. And in those cracks, you'll find something most people never noticed because they were never supposed to. Documents released under FOIA years later revealed internal memos with mission parameters that never appeared in any public-facing NASA statement. One particular briefing, labeled AP13SPE-C013X, referenced experimental sensor payloads and off-nominal signal mapping. The terminology was vague by design, but to anyone familiar with how classified missions are cloaked under scientific language, it was a red flag. Even more curious, a line item that simply read, Observation Window, 1944 to 2010, Lunar Far Side, non-scheduled data capture. What were they planning to observe on the far side of the moon? And why was it labeled non-scheduled? Now, here's where things get stranger. An interview with a former Lockheed contractor who worked indirectly on mission architecture included this chilling remark: Apollo 13 wasn't meant to land, but it wasn't just meant to orbit either. He described overhearing fragments of high-clearance conversations about contact preparation and biometric monitoring, implying the astronauts were under surveillance, not just physically, but neurologically. That aligns with the inclusion of never-before-used biometric sensors in the crew suits. Officially, these were said to provide more accurate medical data, but the data was routed through a secondary system, not accessible to the mission's medical team. So who was really collecting that information? And then there's the target zone. Originally, Apollo 13's trajectory would have brought it within visual range of a very specific region on the moon's surface, near the Dakar Highlands. This area had long been flagged by classified satellite scans for its thermal irregularities. Some insiders have claimed that strange, transient heat signatures were detected in this region as early as 1967, too consistent to be random, too structured to be natural. Yet none of these anomalies were ever mentioned in NASA's public releases. One theory suggests that Apollo 13 was sent to capture visual confirmation of these structures. Another, more controversial, claims that we'd already made contact during previous missions, and this flight was designed to re-establish it. That would explain the sudden, unexplained modifications to the service module in the final week before launch. Photographic analysis of pre-launch images reveals an unusual protrusion on the module's exterior, later digitally removed from official NASA photos. Independent researchers have speculated that this was either a low-frequency communication array or a passive relay system. Either way, it wasn't standard, and it wasn't for talking to Houston. To go even further, Why Apollo 13? Why this crew? This timing? Some believe that Apollo 13 was a cover, that a parallel operation, unmanned or black budget, was launched during the same launch window, using the chaos of the explosion to shift public attention. A kind of celestial misdirection, while the world watched 3 astronauts fight for their lives. What else went up into space unnoticed? One document, unverified, but leaked from a defense contractor's archive, lists a launch window for an S-class object deployment, marked April 12, 1970. That's one day after Apollo 13 lifted off. The object's purpose? Surface mapping and advanced contact calibration. It was never acknowledged again. And here's something even more buried in the shadows. Apollo 13's planned experiments were almost entirely replaced just 2 weeks before launch. Originally, they were to deploy seismic sensors and test lunar soil composition. But suddenly, those experiments were scrapped in favor of passive scan equipment and deep-range telemetry beacons. That might sound technical, but ask any radio technician. Those are tools used to listen, not to Earth, to something else. So what were they listening for? Former astronaut Gordon Cooper, known for his outspoken beliefs about extraterrestrial presence, once said in a private recording, "The public thinks the moon is a dead rock, but some of us, we know better." Could it be that Apollo 13 was not only a mission of exploration, but of confirmation? That NASA, under pressure from deeper forces, sent a team to verify something seen, but never spoken of, to gather signals from the far side, or even to initiate something prearranged? And if so, what stopped it? Was the explosion truly a coincidence? A system malfunction no one could have predicted? Or was it a message? You don't go further. You don't knock again. You already got your warning. For years, these questions were dismissed as conspiracy. But more and more insiders, engineers, technicians, mission analysts are breaking silence. And the picture they paint is chilling. Apollo 13 wasn't just turned around by fire and malfunction. It was turned around by design. Because whatever waited out there, whatever they were meant to see, wasn't ready to be seen. Or maybe it saw us first. There's something that doesn't sit right with what happened after the explosion. Not the way the crew responded. They were professionals, trained beyond belief, and their survival is still one of the most impressive feats in space history. But rather, what they didn't say. Or maybe what they weren't allowed to say. Let's rewind to the hours before the infamous tank failure. Inside the command module, things were quiet, routine. But mission logs show that between 46 and 50 hours into the flight, something unusual happened. An increase in electrical noise on the onboard systems. Buzzing static interference. Now, these aren't uncommon in space. Solar flares, radio overlap, even distant pulsars can produce anomalies. But this interference came from within the ship's own systems. Multiple engineers later confirmed it resembled feedback, like the ship was trying to process a signal it didn't understand. Minutes before the explosion, astronaut Jack Swigert mentioned a flicker on one of the radar displays, something that caught his attention but wasn't logged as critical. It wasn't until years later, during a rare interview, that Swigert admitted seeing a movement near the spacecraft. It wasn't a star. Stars don't curve and glide like that. NASA's response was swift and predictable. Instrument, glitch, refraction, space debris, anything but what it might have been. Something with controlled movement, outside the capsule, silent, close. Then, the explosion. Officially, it was caused by a damaged oxygen tank. But what triggered that damage? What if it wasn't a random event, but a response? Several minutes of raw transmission audio were lost. NASA claimed it was due to signal transition zones, the handoff between Earth-based antennas. But former telecom engineers now admit those zones are highly redundant. Complete loss is unlikely, especially during such a critical moment. In that same missing window, mission transcript logs record strange silence from the crew. Not technical silence, personal silence. For roughly 3 minutes, all 3 astronauts said nothing, even though protocol required continuous updates. What happened during those 3 minutes? A whistleblower from the Deep Space Network, speaking under anonymity, once revealed that a separate listening station picked up non-human modulation, sounds or pulses not identified in any Earth-based language or mechanical system. This data was reportedly intercepted, classified, and never returned to civilian research teams. And then came the shift. Post-explosion, the mission changed. Not just the trajectory, the tone. The crew grew more measured, their voices tighter. There's a part of the downlink where Lovell, the commander, pauses for nearly 15 seconds after being asked a routine question. When he finally replies, his tone is low, almost shaken. "We're assessing. Give us a moment." Some believe that moment wasn't just about calculations. It was about what they'd just seen or heard, and how much they could even admit out loud. Later, in a post-mission debrief, Lovell wrote that spatial orientation felt unusual after the event. He described an overwhelming sense of being watched, despite knowing no known object was nearby. Swigert and Hayes reportedly refused to comment on that section of the mission logs. And when questioned by journalists, they changed the subject or leaned on humor to deflect. But one piece leaked. In 1974, a junior archivist from NASA accidentally uploaded a mislabeled data packet to a university system. Inside, a 13-second audio clip from Apollo 13 that had never been aired publicly. It was grainy, broken, but chilling. It featured Lovell's voice, whispering, "It's behind us. We didn't see it come." That clip vanished within 24 hours, but not before it was downloaded and mirrored by amateur researchers. And even though NASA denied its authenticity, spectrographic analysis of the voice matches known recordings from that day. In other words, it was real. If something was out there and the crew encountered it, the question isn't just what it was, but why it was never reported. What could make 3 of the most respected, decorated astronauts of this century stay silent? Was it fear, shame, or orders? We know that certain protocols exist for unexpected contact. Even back then, NASA had conditioned Sigma policies, set of emergency codes for unidentified objects or signals that could cause public panic. These protocols allow for encryption, delay, and even destruction of live feed if necessary. Apollo 13 may have triggered one of those codes. What's more haunting is the possibility that the explosion itself wasn't an accident, but a self-destruct response, a way to terminate the mission safely without revealing what truly happened. Maybe they did see something. Maybe that something was never supposed to be captured on film, never supposed to be acknowledged. And maybe, just maybe, the silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound. It was the sound of secrecy closing in. When the world heard the words, "Houston, we've had a problem," everyone assumed the emergency began with that call. But what if the real reason Apollo 13 turned back didn't start with an explosion and didn't end with engineering? To this day, the official narrative is simple. An oxygen tank failed, causing a cascade of technical issues that forced the crew to abort the lunar landing and return to Earth. The story is clean, logical, comforting, but the truth rarely is. Let's return to the mission's turning point. Not the explosion itself, but the moments immediately before and after. Shortly before the blast, telemetry data showed a fluctuation in the ship's power levels. Technicians described it as a brief surge, followed by an unexplained dip. This wasn't normal. In fact, it resembled the kind of power fluctuation caused by electromagnetic interference, the kind that might occur in the presence of a powerful external field. Yet no natural field strong enough to affect Apollo 13 systems was anywhere near its flight path. At least, none that we know of. Here's what's curious. After the damage, instead of executing a return trajectory that would bring them home as quickly as possible, NASA instructed the crew to loop around the far side of the moon, a longer, colder, riskier route. Publicly, they said it was to use the moon's gravity to slingshot the ship back. But several former NASA engineers have since questioned that move. It wasn't the fastest option, nor the safest. And here's the strange part. In the 6 hours leading up to that maneuver, NASA's internal logs show an unusual increase in encrypted communications, not just with the Apollo capsule, but between Earth-based stations. And some of those messages weren't even routed through traditional NASA systems. They went through third-party military channels. What were they discussing? Why wasn't it logged? And why, during this window, did the crew grow quiet again? Not technically, but emotionally? Audio analysis from the mission suggests increased vocal tension, more pauses, less casual conversation. One researcher described it as the tone of people who've been warned, not just informed. And here's where it gets even stranger. During the moon slingshot phase, when the spacecraft was on the dark side, completely out of communication with Earth, something happened. We know this because when contact was re-established, the crew was different. Not shaken from the cold, not from fear of failure. Something else in the transcripts. Lovell's voice is slower, measured. He starts asking mission control questions that don't seem technical, but philosophical. Do you believe in purpose? That we're guided? Swigert interrupts him, tries to redirect, but Lovell returns to it later. There's more out here than we understand. This wasn't a man afraid of dying. It was someone who had seen something and was trying to process what it meant. According to a classified report, later leaked by a retired contractor, there was discussion within NASA leadership about ending the mission before the explosion occurred. That's right. There were quiet preparations to recall Apollo 13, even before anything technically failed. Why? Because of what had been detected on long-range scans. An object, metallic, silent, pacing the ship at a distance of several kilometers. It was never acknowledged in the public mission briefings, but it appeared on a single scan, captured by a deep space radar facility in Australia. The blip lasted 19 seconds, and then nothing. Some believe it was an artifact, a false positive. But that same facility later received a phone call from Washington, instructing them to delete the data, not archive, not reprocess, delete. This raises a terrifying possibility that Apollo 13 didn't turn back because of the damage, but because of an encounter, a presence, something that signaled, you're not welcome here, not now. And if that's true, the explosion wasn't a random event. It may have been a warning, or worse, a forced malfunction, engineered to give them no choice but to return. NASA, of course, denies this, always has. But consider this. No other Apollo mission after 13 was ever this unstable. No unexplained failures, no anomalies. And after Apollo 17, they stopped going to the moon entirely. Was it a coincidence? Or did Apollo 13 cross an invisible line, one they were told not to cross again? In a 1995 private interview, Hayes was asked if he ever wished they'd landed. His reply? Not after what we felt up there. No, he didn't say saw. He said felt, as if something unseen had wrapped itself around that spacecraft and whispered turn back. What force, what entity could hold such power over the most advanced space agency on Earth? Was it extraterrestrial, dimensional, something ancient, or something buried in the shadows of black-budget programs we're never meant to see? The further we dig, the clearer it becomes. The reason Apollo 13 turned back wasn't simply because of damage. It was because something or someone decided they would not go further. It's one of the most unsettling facts about Apollo 13, not what was broadcast, But what wasn't? You've probably heard the official audio countless times. The calm, rehearsed voices of astronauts reporting damage. The tension in Houston's control room. The urgency of engineers scrambling for solutions. But what if I told you that not all of it was shared? That 6 full hours of mission audio are missing, not classified, not redacted, simply gone, according to public records. NASA archived almost all Apollo 13 transmissions, from liftoff to splashdown. But curiously, between mission elapsed time 55 to 30 and 61 to 40, covering part of the spacecraft's critical power-down phase, there's an unexplained absence. The logs jump forward. Entire blocks of recorded dialogue are absent from NASA's publicly available data. Initially, this was brushed off as irrelevant chatter or damaged recordings. But independent researchers, some of whom spent years reconstructing mission timelines, noticed something odd. Those 6 hours line up precisely with the moon's radio shadow. That's the point when Apollo 13 passed behind the moon, severing contact with Earth temporarily. When the spacecraft re-emerged from that blackout, audio resumed, but the tone was different. The astronauts weren't just focused, they sounded disturbed. In those first few minutes back in contact, Lovell gives a half laugh, then says, "I guess there's a reason they call it the dark side." Hayes responds, "Let's just get home." Swigert barely says a word for the next 30 minutes. What happened during that silence? The public assumes nothing, that it was just dead air. But internal, NASA sources tell a different story. A former mission recorder technician, speaking anonymously decades later, revealed that off-record transmissions occurred even while the spacecraft was behind the moon, through a process called burst transmission, short, encrypted data, bursts that could be captured intermittently via lunar satellites. And what's more disturbing is that some of these transmissions were not just voice, they contained images. Low resolution, time-stamped, heavily compressed, but unmistakably unusual. One image, never officially released, reportedly shows a crescent of the moon illuminated by reflected light. That in itself isn't strange. But near the top edge of the frame, barely visible, is a shape, angular, metallic, hovering above the surface. Some who have examined the photo say it looks like a structure, a kind of tower or antenna, casting a sharp shadow on the lunar dust. NASA's official response? Lens flare, glitch, compression artifact. But the technician insisted. We saw dozens of images that night. That one, they told us to delete. Another retired comms specialist confirmed something even more eerie. That part of the lost audio wasn't lost by accident. It was manually pulled from rotation after a review meeting in April 1970, just days after the mission ended. At that meeting, select audio was played to senior NASA and military officials. Most of it was routine. But one short exchange triggered concern. Lovell reportedly says, "I see it again. It's not moving, just watching," followed by silence. Then Hayes, "Tell Houston?" Lovell answers, "No, not unless they ask." It's not in the official transcripts, but multiple personnel recall hearing that exact phrase. No one knows what it was. No one from NASA has ever publicly acknowledged the moment. But it sparked internal debate over whether to increase censorship on future missions. In fact, following Apollo 13, mission audio protocols were revised. Transmissions could now be filtered live. Only approved content would reach the public feed. Everything else went through secure lines. Why? What did they encounter in those 6 silent hours? Even Carl Sagan, in a lesser-known interview from the late 70s, hinted at the gaps in Apollo's public record. He said, "What we were told was heroic. What we weren't told is where the real questions lie." Let that sink in. if 6 hours of audio were deliberately removed, and if those missing moments contained visual data, emotional reactions, and possibly sightings of unknown phenomena, then we're looking at more than just a technical failure. We're looking at an intentional blackout, a wall built between truth and the public, not to protect us from panic, perhaps, but to protect something else. Because if even a whisper of what was seen during Apollo 13 made it to the public, a glimpse of intelligent presence, a structure not built by human hands, or a sensation of being watched from above, then the world would have changed overnight. And maybe that's exactly what they were trying to avoid. What happens to a man after he walks to the edge of oblivion and returns, not just physically, but emotionally? When the Apollo 13 crew made it back to Earth, they were welcomed as heroes. There were interviews, parades, handshakes, even awards. The world saw them smile, but the smiles were tight, controlled. And sometimes, just sometimes, they didn't reach the eyes. You see, something changed in them. Not in a loud or obvious way. It was subtle, quiet, but if you looked closely, you could feel it, like a shadow behind their words. Something unsaid pressing at the edges of every sentence. Something they carried but never put into words. Lovell, the mission commander, gave dozens of interviews over the years. He was polished, careful, always respectful to NASA, always aligned with the official story. But listen closely. Not just to what he said, but how he said it. His tone would shift when asked about certain moments, about the hours when communication dropped, about what they saw or didn't see out there. He'd pause, breathe, then move the answer somewhere else. Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, once said in an offhand remark during a closed seminar, "There are things up there you wouldn't believe." I wouldn't have either before. No one pressed him. Maybe they didn't want to hear the rest. Maybe they were told not to. Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, was quieter after the mission. He gave fewer interviews. And when he did, he spoke in abstractions. Once, when asked what it felt like to almost die in space, he replied, "We were already somewhere else, mentally." You start to understand what really matters when you're that far from home. That might sound poetic, but what if it wasn't? What if it wasn't just far from home that haunted them, or what they saw on the way back? There are psychological reports, most redacted, that were filed after Apollo 13 returned. NASA, like any organization, performs routine assessments after traumatic events. But something stood out. According to a leaked document allegedly sourced from inside Johnson Space Center, one of the astronauts experienced recurring visions during sleep and displayed profound existential distress, unrelated to physical exhaustion. The report never said who died, and then there were the silences, not just in their interviews, but between each other. For men who went through something so impossible together, they rarely spoke publicly as a trio afterward. Of course, life moves on, but there's a difference between drifting apart and choosing not to talk about what happened. Some researchers believe the mission marked a turning point, not just for NASA, but for those three men. A point where the line between known and unknown blurred too much. A line they never wanted to cross again. One former NASA technician who worked on Apollo communications claimed he overheard an internal conversation where one astronaut said, "I saw something I can't explain, and I won't talk about it again." Now, could this be stress? Trauma? The weight of almost dying? That's what skeptics will say. But people who have studied military secrecy, psychological containment, and high-level briefings know something else. That truth is often buried under layers of carefully scripted silence. Sometimes, it's not about what was said, but what wasn't allowed to be. Ask yourself this. Why did these three men, smart, disciplined, trained to observe and report with precision, come back from a failed moon mission, acting like they'd seen something far beyond mechanical failure? Why did their public stories shrink, tighten, and grow colder over time? And why, if it was just a near-miss mission, does it feel like their eyes are trying to say something, even as their mouths remain silent? Have you ever wondered why we stopped going to the moon? After the triumphant success of Apollo 11 and the momentum of missions 12 through 17, something changed. NASA had the technology, the budget, the political support. And yet, after Apollo 17 in 1972, we never went back. Not once. Not with people. It doesn't add up. Unless you consider this. What if Apollo 13 wasn't just a mission that failed to reach the moon, but one that was warned not to? And what if what they saw, what they encountered in those black, soundless miles, was never meant for us? Let's go back. In the declassified notes of Project Horizon, a pre-NASA military concept for moon colonization, there were proposals. As early as 1959, to use the lunar surface for surveillance, even weapons platforms. They considered the moon a strategic location. And with Apollo, they finally had access. But there's one detail that very few talk about. Certain regions of the moon were consistently avoided during every mission. Areas that, on surface maps, appear perfectly ordinary. But according to whistleblowers, those sectors, especially around the far side craters like Tsiolkovsky, were flagged for electromagnetic disturbances, strange reflections, and unexplained radar anomalies. Instruments would spike, guidance would briefly fail, and sometimes eerie signals were picked up, non-random, pulsing, repeating, as if someone was watching. During Apollo 13, the intended landing site was Fra Mauro. That's what we were told. But internal flight plans obtained years later suggest there was a proposed deviation, an alternative site only labeled as Zone 6B. No photos of this location exist publicly. No coordinates were ever published. Only that it lay deeper into the lunar highlands, and that it had a unique magnetic signature. Then the explosion happened, too soon, too conveniently, and just like that, Apollo 13 turned around. What if the explosion was not a malfunction, but an intervention? What if they were never meant to land because of what was waiting in Zone 6B? Multiple independent researchers, including former defense contractors, have claimed that the moon is not as lifeless as we've been led to believe. They speak of structures angular, metallic, partially buried in regolith. They talk about shadows that move, without a source, and light's brief flickers of movement seen from Earth, even now, through amateur telescopes, lights that shouldn't be there. Is it any wonder, then, that after Apollo 13, the tone changed? Apollo 14 went forward reluctantly. So did 15, 16, and finally 17. But something was different. The missions were shorter, tighter, and the astronauts became more rehearsed, less open, until, after 1972, silence. And what about the moon itself? Why did we suddenly decide it wasn't worth returning? Billions spent, technology proven, public interest still high, but nothing, decades of nothing. And even when new planned surface missions delayed, postponed, or converted to unmanned, could it be that we weren't allowed back? Buzz Aldrin once said during a cryptic interview, we should visit the monolith, the one on Phobos. It's a very unusual object. Who put that there? Who put that there? But maybe he wasn't just talking about Mars. Maybe he was speaking in code. Maybe the real monolith, the real unknown, was never out there, but already found and buried on the moon. And perhaps Apollo 13 got too close. Some believe that message was received loud and clear. Turn back. That space was never empty. That the moon was never ours. And after that, no human set foot there again. It's a theory that chills you, not because it's flashy or fantastical, but because it fits. Like a puzzle piece you didn't know was missing. Because the real question is not why Apollo 13 failed, but what they saw and who didn't want us to see more. It's easy to believe that Apollo 13 came back to Earth because of a technical malfunction, that the explosion of the oxygen tank sealed the crew's fate and forced an emergency return, that it was all just an accident, one that could have killed 3 men but didn't, a near tragedy turned triumph. That's the story we've all been told. But what if it was never just about the oxygen tank? What if Apollo 13's return wasn't driven by necessity, but by orders? What if the true reason they came home so quickly, so suddenly, was never mechanical but existential? You see, by the time the Apollo missions were well underway, the U.S. space program had reached an unspoken crossroads. Behind the official triumphs and smiling press conferences, something else was building, something invisible. A tension not between man and machine, but between us and the unknown. The more we reached into space, the more we began to encounter things that didn't belong. Lights that moved against the laws of physics, unexplained signals, missing time, and most importantly, data we weren't meant to see. Apollo 13, for all its public failure, may have been the mission that crossed a line. Remember the lost transmission? Nearly 6 hours of unexplained audio blacked out from the records? The technical explanation? Signal interference. But that doesn't match what we've heard from insiders. According to several anonymous sources within NASA and Defense Intelligence, those 6 hours were anything but silent. They were filled with panic, with confusion, with questions from the astronauts that no one on Earth could or would answer. Voice reportedly said, "It's not debris. It's holding position." Another, "We're being observed. I repeat, we are not alone." And then, silence. The feed returned. But the tone? It had changed. The crew was instructed to abort all objectives, to secure power systems, to prepare for immediate return. No more scans, no more photos, no more exploration. Just come home. And so they did. They re-entered Earth's atmosphere as heroes' faces tight with forced smiles, eyes that had seen something they weren't allowed to speak of. Publicly, it was a celebration, but privately, something had shifted. The narrative moved quickly to damage control. The explosion was the only story allowed to survive. Engineers were praised, procedures reviewed, documentaries made. But the questions? Those were buried. Even the astronauts themselves changed. Lovell, who had once spoken with ease about spaceflight, became more reserved. Swigert fell into political silence. And Hayes barely spoke publicly again, because how do you explain something you're not supposed to believe in? How do you tell the world that maybe, just maybe, space isn't empty? That our missions to the moon weren't just scientific explorations, but provocations? That someone or something was already there, watching? It's no coincidence that Apollo 14, 15, 16, and 17 followed such strict, narrow guidelines. That we never deviated. That after 1972, we stopped entirely. Because after Apollo 13, the message was clear. We pushed too far. We saw too much. And the return to Earth? That wasn't a retreat. It was a warning. The moon had spoken not with words, but with presence. With silence that pressed on the human mind like a weight. With shadows that seemed to move behind you when you weren't looking. With frequencies that didn't belong to any known spectrum. And the real reason Apollo 13 came home was because continuing meant crossing a threshold humanity wasn't ready for. So the mission ended early. Not out of failure, but compliance. They didn't just return to Earth, they were brought back. Because space may be infinite, but our invitation to explore it might not be. Which leaves us with the final question. If they turn back to protect use from what's out there, then who or what is still waiting for us to try again? If you've made it this far, it means you felt something. Maybe it was a spark of curiosity. Maybe it was that quiet chill when you realized not everything we've been told is the whole story. Or maybe, deep down, you already knew God. So if this message echoed something inside you, something you can't quite explain, then you're not alone. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. Because the truth, it doesn't stop here. It's just getting louder. And if this story hit you in a way you didn't expect, comment right now. I feel the pull. Let's see how many of us are out here, looking deeper, asking more, refusing. Silence. Hit the like button if you believe not everything up there or down here is what it seems. And if your mind is still racing, click the next video on your screen, the one waiting in the shadows, because what we found on the moon might not be staying there forever.